Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Traver. I've got Gary with us once again. I'm excited about it. He is going through a few more items on connecting the feast days with the New Testament, showing believers why it is that it's so important. That's one of the things that originally drew me to it. Is I kept seeing this theme throughout the New Testament. Even with Paul, it's evident that it's with Paul. And Gary's a really good articulator of all that. So, Gary, first of all, thanks for the first session that we had last time.
My pleasure.
As I told you, my dad is a listener, and my dad, of course, has me on speed dial. And he called me and he said, "Hey, this is the first time that I heard, you went through the Menorah thing last time. And the first time he had heard that Yom Teruah, or the Feast of Trumpets, takes center stage in how you are articulating the cycle."
Yeah.
So most commentators are going to put Shavuot or Pentecost in the middle, but you don't. I know why you don't, but could you explain for everyone why it is that it's laid out with Yom Teruah at the center?
Sure. Yeah. And it was pretty quick last week, so I do understand if it's the first time you've heard it, it might not completely connect. So it's good that we're going to have a chance to review that, actually. The Yom Teruah, one of the things that I didn't mention, because we're running a little short on time, is Yom Teruah, first of all, is a kind of center point for the festival cycle. It certainly appears in the center, as you're walking through it, as we talked about last week. That feast actually deals with the subject of enthronement.
Okay,
It is the feast where Messiah not only returns to claim his bride, but he becomes officially enthroned as the ruler of the world. And one of the things that I think is lost in many Christian circles is the fact that while Messiah stands at the right hand of the Father now, or is seated there, however you want to look at it, but he's next to the Father, right? In a sense, he and the Father rule the universe, but he has allowed other forces to rule the earth at the present time. It's like the earth may be that cosmic exception where it's a little bit of hands off. It's not complete taking of authority. And that's for a purpose. He has a purpose in all of this. And there's coming a time when that season will end and Yeshua will take his rightful place on the throne over the earth, as well as over the cosmos. And so when you view Yom Teruah in that perspective, then you begin to see why that might sit in the center, why that is so important, because that's the critical event of human history, is that very event.
Right.
Even more than the resurrection, believe it or not, but as important as that is. So what we did last week is I put the emphasis on, when you look at this menorah, what's very important is that you go to the Hebrew. That's what my wife did about 23, 24 years ago. She went back to the Hebrew to look carefully at how it's laid out in the Hebrew language. And there the problem becomes very clear, because we're looking for a pattern of 7. As we talked a little bit about how important those patterns of 7 are. The only pattern of 7 connected with the festivals is the one that I articulated for you, that goes with first day of unleavened bread, seventh day of unleavened bread, Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonements, first day of Tabernacles, 8th day. That is the only one. And this, by the way, is very easy to show. Anyone can do it. A child can do this. A child could actually just read the scripture, knowing the Hebrew word, and they don't have to know Hebrew. Just be aware that a particular Hebrew word is connected with these days, and you just walk it through. The reason Shavuot or Pentecost gets put in the center is people have monkeyed with the pattern. Mm-hmm. They have inserted something over here, which forces the entire system, as it were, to be displaced one unit over.
So then what
now Shabbat moves into this position.
What have they inserted?
The resurrection.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see how that was not set well with some people.
Oh, I understand that.
Yeah. So what are we overlooking then? Like for me, the way I've articulated it in my past is I've said, well, first of all, you have to understand that the resurrection or first fruit, Yeshua being that, is directly tied to Shavuot. So it's not. So it's not that it isn't in there. It is in there, but it's part of that 50-day cycle.
That's right. That's right.
So that's number one for me. The other part for me, and this could just be, me justifying something I don't even know, but for us, resurrection is the anomaly.
Correct.
For Yahweh, it's just what he does. This is just another thing. For Yahweh, death is the anomaly.
Yes.
So if you reverse that whole paradigm of thinking,
yes,
resurrection for Yahweh is nothing. This is just what Yahweh does. It's all about life. It's just, and I think that we put it there because we are humans so faced with death all the time that we want to elevate that. And it's not that we shouldn't elevate it. It's just, am I thinking right?
No, I love what you just said. And I've heard you say it before, and I've always been impressed by that answer. I think it's a very impressive answer. I think it because Yahweh has his perspective on these things, and we have our perspective. And what I'm advocating is let's go with Yahweh's perspective rather than our own.
Oh, yeah.
And that is really the crux of the matter. As you mentioned, the resurrection is the first day. It initiates the counting of the Omer, which takes us through to the day of Pentecost. In fact, you cannot determine the time of Pentecost properly without the counting of the Omer. So there's this real relationship between the resurrection and, interestingly enough, the giving of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost. See, these are tied together. And this is, from Yahweh's perspective, this is what he wants to communicate. See, it's a question of communication. What is Yahweh trying to say to us? Maybe he's not saying things we want to hear. Maybe he's saying something different, and we should be sensitive to that, right? If we're going to get it right.
Gary, and even on this, on the idea of worship, I always want to say to folks, people say, I didn't grow up with Passover. I didn't, and these are believers, and they're strong believers. I didn't grow up with Pentecost. Well, maybe some did. I didn't grow up with sighting the moon. I'm like, you guys got to understand something. You keep talking to me about worship, and you keep telling me how you feel close to God.
Yes.
And I don't doubt that you do, but have you ever considered the question is, how does God feel close to you?
Yes.
And Yahweh feels closest to us when we're walking in obedience and doing those things that elevate the Son. So I'm just like, come on, people, work with me here.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's well said. It's a change of perspective. And so what happened, it became popular very early on for Shavuot to sort of end up in the center. And think about what this means. Shavuot is the one feast that really does center on the believers, on the church, even on Israel when Israel was following the Lord.
Right.
It's on people. It's on people.
Yeah.
It's not on Messiah. Okay. And I'm just asking people to do one simple thing. Go back to the language, walk it through, just read through that chapter. And you know what? It's a no-brainer. It's a slam dunk no-brainer. It really is. That's what it's saying.
It is. And you know what? Sometimes I wonder if sometimes Yahweh didn't pre-program a little, once people start to get it, they can see like, oh yeah, I kind of do put myself in the center, and I ought not do that.
Not do that. Yeah, that's exactly right. So I was going to say something. I think it slipped my mind, unfortunately. See if I can take a few moments to get it back. But this perspective thing is extreme importance in how we view things, and being able to see things from God's perspective. The other thing about this is what I was going to say. If you insert something here, you have to drop something over here.
Yeah.
The thing that gets dropped is the eighth day. Oh my gosh, the eighth day. I could spend podcasts on that and show people that the eighth day is actually the culmination of the whole thing. It's the culmination. So you're inserting something here and you're dropping off the culmination. It just gets absorbed into Sukkot. And by doing that, you miss the entire point of the 8th day. We just celebrated the 8th day, as I know you did as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, it is deep. And it is the only festival day that can be properly understood when you have the New Testament. You can't understand this day without the New Testament. See, that's the thing that's remarkable. We're given some insights in several places, 2 Peter, and obviously at the end of Revelation, especially, and in a few other places in the New Testament, which open up that mystery. Because this day of all the days, the Jews can tell you the meaning of all these days, except this one. They're clueless. They don't have any idea what the 8th day means.
Yep. So
in fact, there was a famous paper that was published about 2012 from a well-known Jewish rabbi. You know what the title of his paper was? The 8th day, a feast about nothing in particular.
Yeah.
Can you imagine that?
I know. I don't want to.
Can you imagine that? The feast day about nothing in particular? You can tell me all the other 6. You can go on and wax eloquently. Books and books and books have been published over the last 2,000 years in Judaism about the other 6. And all of a sudden you arrive at the very end and you don't know what it means. That's what you're confessing. But believers in Messiah can know what this means.
Well, are you going to give us the Cliff Notes version, or are we going to have to wait for that? Or you've just done your commercial for when we do the 8th day?
Yeah, that's exactly what I've done. Yeah.
Okay. We'll just leave you all hanging.
We'll keep you hanging. That's right. Because it is a truly marvelous, remarkable thing. And we talked about it this last celebration that we had, where it's understandable why there would be confusion about it, because when the prophets do speak of this day, there's a kind of back and forth melding of ideas and thoughts, particularly from the prophet Isaiah, that tie the 8th day to tabernacles. So most people just say, well, it must be part of tabernacles. But that's not the message of the prophets. And that's made abundantly clear, I believe, especially by John in Revelation and by Paul in Corinthians. They both address this issue. And they're telling us, no, guys, it's a little more involved than that.
Yeah.
And it's a truly wondrous mystery. So this is the thing that I have a problem with, is if you're going to have to absorb that day and almost pretend like it's not there in order to develop your scheme, maybe you need to reevaluate your scheme. This is like, to me, this is kind of like a Bible code, the real Bible code. And like any codes, right, you have something that represents something else. Usually, if you're talking linguistically, you have letters that represent other letters, and you have this mysterious code that you can make no sense of unless you have an understanding of the pattern that underlies that code that allows you to interpret the code.
Right.
If you monkey with the code, guess what's going to happen? If we were trying to figure out the enigma in World War II, right, we were trying to break that code so we could understand what the Germans were doing, right? If they had monkeyed with the code, they said, I don't like this code. I think I'll just change it over here, or I'll change it over here. They would have had no hope of breaking that code. It would have been gibberish.
That's right. Can't do it.
So why are we doing this? Why are we always monkeying with the code? Let the code be the code. Let the code be exactly as God laid it out. And I must say one other thing too. Things are starting to change. People are coming around to the view that I'm talking about. The earlier generation of people had it one way, and they're now beginning to understand, wait a minute, something's not quite fitting here. It's a little out of kilter. We need to re-examine this. And we're finding just in the last 5, 6, 7 years that more and more people are beginning to catch on with this for that reason, because it's simple, it's straightforward.
And I think that, unfortunately, one of the things that was happening when people, there are some people that started to get into the messianic view in this way, the stuff that we're talking about. They wanted to do the feast days. They saw that Paul hadn't thrown this stuff out, but they still wanted to somehow figure out a way to fit the feast days in the rubric of Christian thinking.
That's exactly right.
I understand that, but at the same time, you're precisely right. It's a good way to talk about it is let the code be the code. It doesn't diminish our idea of resurrection. It doesn't diminish salvation by grace.
No.
It just
absolutely not.
It doesn't. In fact, no. It doesn't at all. Exactly.
That's right.
So it's okay. You don't need to think that you're going to let go of something that's very important to us as believers.
That's right.
The resurrection, salvation by faith. We don't let that go by letting the code be the code.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I just come back to what you shared earlier, which is just wonderful to see it from a God's perspective rather than our own.
Yeah,
that's so important in so many things. So it's a good object lesson for us. Is we will sometimes jump to conclusions because we have an idea in our own minds that like you said, we want to hold on to, and give it an importance that, as important as it is, maybe doesn't have the same level of importance in God's mind. It's important. But God has other things on his mind that he's trying to communicate. And then we're missing the communication because we're so obsessed with what's important to us.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
well, if you're a listener, just know this, when I first started following all this, I totally get how your heart is rooted in your culture. Mm-hmm. So, for a long time, I wanted to hold on to Christmas. Because I grew up with that. I mean, it was something, the twinkly lights and all that. Now, the good news is though I don't do that, the twinkly lights have a place in Hanukkah. It has a place, and I still get to drink my hot cocoa and taste peppermint. Still none of that's gone. But I understand our ties. They're often irrational. We just want the things we had growing up because it made us feel warm and cuddly. The good news is there's plenty of warm and cuddlies to be had in doing things the right way as well. All right, Gary, take it away. You've got some new info for us today.
Okay, so I'll just let me remind you of this fact because I'm going to just say a few words following it that hopefully will kind of tie this all together. So we go back to Passover, first day of unleavened bread. I often do combine those together for reasons we talked about last time. And this has a lot to do with redemption. In its original giving, it was the redemption of Israel from Egypt. Now, redemption is an interesting word because we have kind of a colloquial definition for that term that has emerged and what we think of when we talk about redemption. Often we'll say that person redeemed themselves, which actually is, I think, an oxymoron, but but it's not, but people will talk that way, right? They redeem themselves. Oh, they gave themselves redemption. Oh, okay. How'd they do that? Well, some good deed or some good act. That's not redemption. Redemption is to be purchased back to God. And this is what Israel was. Israel had been remote from God for a season. They eventually got enslaved in Egypt. And God, recognizing that these were his people whom he had called through Abraham, said, it's now time for me to buy them back. So he went through this process with them of the redemption. And this redemption means to be bought back, but it's bought back for a purpose. It's not just buyback for the sake of buyback. It's a prelude to a whole change in relationship. Between him and his people, or if we apply it personally, between us as individuals and God. And one of the interesting things about Passover that has been lost, actually, I think, largely in Judaism, or maybe I should say it this way, it's been de-emphasized. That I can say pretty safely. I even think it has been kind of lost, but I'll just say it's been de-emphasized, okay, is the concept of the firstborn. The Passover is really, in its original giving, it's about the feast of the firstborn. And we see this very dramatically in the very last plague, the death of the firstborn. God claims the firstborn of Israel through that ceremony of the Passover when the death angel passes by because the blood is on the doorpost.
Yeah.
See, all of this has deep spiritual meaning. And by the way, the rabbis get some of this. They understand some of this. But if you go to a typical Jewish Seder, you're going to find very little mention of the firstborn in it. And yet it's kind of the goal, the whole purpose of that celebration. And so, in fact, God even calls Israel is my firstborn. The whole nation was his firstborn.
Right.
Now, what does that mean? What is a firstborn in families, especially in more ancient families where you had large families and the firstborn occupied a very special position. They were kind of like the bridge from the other siblings to the parents. That's what a firstborn really was. The firstborn had charge of the siblings, was to take care of the siblings, to watch out for them, to instruct them in the values of the parents, to see that those things were transmitted down to the next generation.
Yeah.
And to produce family harmony. And this is why the firstborn gets such a privileged status in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh, is because of that responsibility. And when firstborns failed in that responsibility, God took that very seriously. And we see many failures. In fact, one of the things about the patriarchs is there's every generation, the firstborn who was called to do this task failed, and it had to fall to someone else in line, one of the other siblings.
Yeah.
Isaac versus Ishmael, Jacob versus Esau, Joseph versus Reuben and Judah.
Yeah.
Do I need to go on?
Nope.
The physical firstborn failed, but God had a spiritual firstborn right in line to take their place.
Right.
That's one of the messages of the entire story of the patriarchs. And we see this worked out through Israel herself. Israel was God's physical firstborn. Did they succeed or did they fail? They failed. They succeeded occasionally, very sporadically.
I ask the question
Yeah.
at this point, is Adam a firstborn and failed, and then the last Adam or second Adam?
Yes.
I forget how Paul phrases it.
Yes.
Does it right?
That's right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. Yeah. So
Okay.
from the New Testament perspective, and even in Genesis, we get a hint of this through Abel and Cain, right? Cain was
Yeah.
the firstborn.
Yeah.
Abel was the secondborn.
Gotcha.
Now, who is righteous? Abel. And he died for it. He died because of righteousness. That's what the Apostle John tells us, because he was
Yep.
the righteous one. And then Seth takes the place of Abel as the kinsman redeemer.
Mm.
See,
Yeah.
all of this is foreshadowed in the book of Genesis. It's right at the beginning. God is setting a pattern there that just follows its way through. And yes, ultimately, as you point out from Paul in Romans, talking about Messiah now is that firstborn. He's the firstborn, but he comes as the firstborn who's replacing Adam, right?
Right.
In
Yeah.
this case, yeah.
Yeah.
Because now he's not just the firstborn over even a group of people, but it's over all of humanity.
Yeah.
So this is just a foretaste of how important I think these festivals are. The seventh day of unleavened bread is also important, but it's been a little bit more mysterious. And I might have mentioned this last time that this one here, the second one, and the eighth day, or the seventh day of our cycle here, number 2 and 7, are known as Atzeret. Now, Atzeret is a very interesting word. If people want to look it up, it's in the Strong's Hebrew 6116. You can find it there. And you can take a look at that word, and it comes from the root word atzar. And atzar is a fascinating word. It means to kind of like hold back, or it can imply a transition of some kind, some important transition. My wife used to express it, and I enjoyed her teaching on this, as like going from one kingdom, she said, to another, making a transition of some kind. Okay. And we see that in the seventh day in unleavened bread in Israel. Israel was to leave Egypt, and they would have left Egypt on that first day. As far as we know, they gathered on the first day of unleavened bread and then immediately left Egypt thereafter. And we have reason to believe that they had completed their journey out of Egypt proper by this seventh day. And then there's a transition. What's that transition look like? Well, they have to cross the Red Sea, and they go into a wilderness wandering for a season for them, ultimately to arrive at Sinai, which is this third one. And here it's when they receive the law. And we believe that that this occurred on Pentecost. We're not told explicitly, but we're given a bunch of clues in the narrative, which point very strongly to this. And this has been the traditional understanding of Judaism going back as far as I'm aware of into history. And then that part, you see, what we see is a kind of a travel. In Passover, they leave Egypt. The destination is Sinai. In Passover, they leave the world because Egypt is a representation of the world. At Pentecost, they arrive on Mount Sinai to meet with God and to be established as a nation. Now, what's fascinating is this entire spring set of seasons in the spring season, these three festivals, they have direct parallels to the church. Direct. Messiah redeems us. We leave the world. We arrive on the day of Pentecost to receive the fullness of God through the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, into our lives.
Yeah.
You see that pattern? It's the same pattern. By the way, the one is not at exclusion to the other. They're direct parallels. And I think we might have talked a little bit last time about how important it is to understand, in fact, that since both the law and the Spirit were given on the same day, Pentecost, there just might be a relationship between the two that we need to look more deeply into.
Yeah.
Now we come to the fall, and as I mentioned earlier, we have the enthronement of Messiah at his coming. This is very clear, by the way, in the book of Revelation, that this is the time when Messiah assumes control over the earth and now judges the nations, begins the process of judgment that commences here, and most people believe kind of culminates here with the next festival at Yom Teruah, or the Day of Atonements, when the nations are judged, and by the way, Israel is judged as well that same time. And Israel is cleansed, and Israel is brought finally into the right relationship with God, where they can fulfill the commission God originally gave them. See, he has not given up on them. This is one of the great criminal deceptions of history, of church history, is that somehow God has completely rejected his people. There are so many verses in both Old and New Testament that belie that understanding, that it's staggering, and yet people still promulgate it. It's a doctrine that goes back at least to the middle of the 2nd century, and originates with people like Marcion, for instance, who, by the way, was later branded as a complete heretic,
Right.
even though many of his ideas persist within Orthodox Christianity today, quite sadly. But this pair, this couplet of the 4th and the 5th day, they are tied together. And I think properly, the Jewish people understand this. They understand that there's a relationship between these 2 days, where these are bookends of a period of time in which cleansing and judgment are taking place on the nations, and including the nation of Israel herself.
Yeah. So on that, you have more emphatically said that. So the return of Messiah appears in how you're talking about it right there at Yom Teruah.
That's right.
So, yeah, I look forward to that. I have always alluded to that. I was never able to quite express how at least biblically, because I always want to go with the data, right? What's in the text?
What's in the text?
I'm like, I can't figure out if it is a procession starting at Yom Teruah and then culminates, or if it happens all at once, where Messiah returns on Yom Teruah and then something builds up to Yom Kippurim. So there's that part. And then, there was another part. Now I'm like you. I lost what I wanted to. Oh, I know what it was. So if you're listening and you're doing your theology school, so what we're talking about here is replacement theology, where sometimes it's explicitly stated that the church replaced Israel. But what I've found is that there's a lot of churches that really celebrate Israel. They support Israel, but it's a bit of a pseudo support in that even though they won't explicitly state that the church replaced Israel, they function like that. They function as if the church replaced Israel, and right. It never did. It's still the ongoing story of Yahweh's relationship with Israel, and that doesn't diminish me. I am grafted into Israel with all the rights and privileges thereof.
Yes.
And I get to operate and I get to worship my God. And by definition, serve my God by obeying Yahweh's commandments, feast days, statutes, judgments, and so forth.
Yeah, well said. That's exactly right. And too many people don't understand the principle that God can walk and chew gum at the same time. Yeah. I hate to put it that way.
I know.
Sometimes you just have to tell people, look, God is God. You don't think that he can work his plan out on several different levels simultaneously? What kind of God do you worship? My God can do anything he wills to do.
So as you might imagine, so I work at a school that sometimes will have liberal tendencies. And because of that, there's a little bit too many flavors of gum. So couldn't God work through Islam? Couldn't God work through universalism? And so even though you're saying that, there are limits to that.
Absolutely.
But we we need to let the data be the data. See what God is doing and not be afraid of what God is doing. Instead of putting God into our boxes.
Exactly.
Let's instead find out what God actually said, did, what the instruction is, and it doesn't threaten us.
No.
All right.
It's great. And in fact, I like that box analogy. I would often tell people, I says, look, you put God in a box, guess what? Before you can blink your eye, that box has been blown to smithereens.
Yep, that's right.
It's ridiculous what we do. And we all do it.
Yeah.
So it's something that we have to be careful that we don't get trapped into that, because that's where a lot of false understanding and teaching arise, is from trying to box God into a corner, our corner.
Yeah.
But he won't stay there. We can try, but he's not staying.
I am not the boss of God. That's for sure.
Or someone we both used to know who's passed on now, he used to say, God is a whole lot smarter than we are. That's, and that's true. Finally, in the Feast of Tabernacles, we find the fullness and the culmination of the kingdom of God on the earth, and Israel at the head of the nations, God ruling and reigning from Jerusalem, with Israel as his model. They become the model nation for all the other nations of the earth.
So there you're pointing at the last day of Tabernacles.
No, that's the first day of Tabernacles. Can you see it? Okay, it's number 6. So it's number 6.
Okay. Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then now, if we jump to the final culmination, I'll just say this. This is what happens beyond that period of time. It's the next step in God's plan, which is so amazing and wondrous, and of which we as believers only know an inkling of. But that's what this day is concerned with. And yes, I do have a lot I could say about that, but not today.
Yeah, we'll do a whole nother podcast. I'll even title it the 8th day.
Yeah.
So if they find this a year from now, they might be able to go 8th day on Everyday Torah and find it.
Yeah. So that's our menorah. And I'll just remind everyone that, yes, there are these stems here. And I'll just say about the stem connections, or the branches, as some people like to call it, to this central branch or stem. That this does seem to suggest a chiastic structure, which we talked a little bit about last time, and a relationship that exists between these different festivals. And some of that also can be discerned in the Hebrew. We won't have time to go into that in any detail, but I did, I think, mention a few things last time in regard to this. And just as you're going through, I'll just mention to you that as people are going through this, they should kind of keep this in the back of their minds, that, okay, I sort of see the festivals, the individual festivals. Now, what's the next level to really understand how they're tied together and how there exists a certain special relationship between some of the festivals that's distinctive? Then this pattern of the menorah can be very helpful to work that through. Yeah. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. So now I wanted to also, we talked a little bit about some of the themes that are there, and I'm giving you what I call the primary themes, but there are also a number of other threads of meaning which you can work out from these primary themes. The one I walked everyone just through is sort of what I would call the eschatological plan of history that puts Israel at the center because Israel kind of walks that through. It walks sort of the historical narrative through from beginning to end. But there's also that same narrative overlays on top of the church. The church has a parallel track in this. And we alluded to some of that earlier when we talked about the spring festivals. And that's going to continue. And there is for the believer in Messiah, there's yet another thread of meaning that's involved. Then we can take other threads of meaning. It's amazing how many threads there really are. And they all build on the same concepts applied at different levels. So we have Israel, we have the church, then we get the individual believer, how we as individual believers interact with these festivals and understanding what they're trying to tell us about the fundamentals, if you will, about our relationship with Messiah. And so we have that as another layer. And so you start adding up these layers and you realize, wow, if I put all this together, I've now encompassed almost every significant doctrine in the Bible. It really is.
Sure.
And you get a few instructions, and this is how I've noticed God works. In the festivals, you get the basic instructions. They are to get you started. It's the starting point. It's the launch pad to go into the rest of the Bible. And this is something our group, when we met together, and I mentioned this last time, to first study the feast together as a small community. What we were struck by is as soon as you get this basic pattern of the festivals down, now everything changes. It has a ripple effect throughout the entire scriptures, your understanding of the scriptures, because now you have a framework to plug everything into that makes sense. It makes sense of everything. I like to tell people that one of the great advantages of having this understanding is it brings razor sharp clarity to all the concepts you thought you knew you understood.
Yeah, it's two things. Number one, it's first of all, for me as a longtime believer, it is so nice just to understand the Bible.
Yes.
That's number one. Number two, when let's just say you were a part of Israel growing up as a little kid and you were a part of the camp and the tabernacle was just right there by you.
That's right.
I mean, it's so familiar. You know it, you smell it, you see it every day of your life.
Yes.
And one of the things that I've noticed is, as I'm over a decade of observing the feast days. And as I've done that, it's become a part of my life.
Yes.
So when I'm reading the text, it's like I can grab the text so much better because I'm just living it.
That's exactly right. In fact, you just good lead into one of the stories I wanted to tell. Years ago, I knew this woman who was just like we're doing now, was getting very interested in the festivals and observing them, learning about them. And she happened to be a teacher at a Christian school. She taught second graders. Her name was Kathy. And she was a remarkable gal. And I always appreciated her because of her passion and love for her students. And the fact that she did something pretty bold, and she got permission to do it, to walk her second graders through the festivals. And as part of their instruction as second graders. Now,
wow.
This is really pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And so she did it. And unfortunately, since the academic year is a little bit out of sync with the festival seasons, the fall comes first in the academic year and then the spring. She had to teach them in that order. But what she did is she had a whole curriculum that she developed. And each, as the festivals came up in the school year, she would bring in her second graders and have them participate. At the end of this little experiment, she and I sat down. I was very interested in how this went and got her take on things. And she said, Gary, it was unbelievable. She said, I've never as a teacher experienced anything quite like this. The response of the second graders is what blew her away. It was, and of course, they were fortunate to have her as a teacher because she's a very, dynamic and very committed teacher and thought very carefully through how to bring this to them. She had activity, she had fun stuff. She walked them through the Bible, just to lay out, this is what they used to do in ancient Israel.
Yeah.
And she said the response of the kids, they all loved it. They all loved it. When one was over, they said, when's the next one coming? When's the next one? When's the next one? She said she heard that time after time. It would be a few months before they would return. When's it coming? When's it happening? You see, the anticipation that was built because what happened, she said something clicked on with these second graders in their minds. And she said, Gary, they were getting it. They were understanding the Bible. They were understanding things that she was amazed that these kids could articulate, and she would quiz them. She would quiz them to find out what they got out of it. And they were getting it. They were understanding things that, to be honest, many adults have trouble understanding.
Yeah.
And I took that away and I said, that is really remarkable. And I wasn't, like, on the one hand, completely surprised, because knowing her, I thought if anybody could pull it off, she could. But at the same time, it was just amazing to me that it does work. It was both surprising and unsurprising. It works. And as you pointed out, this was designed for children. By the way, children can be spiritual children too. When people are new believers, they're like spiritual children. They need a framework, a rubric to go into and understand, so that they can hang their knowledge on a sound and secure framework. It's like a building, right? You put up a building. What do? You lay out all the 2x4s and you get the structure put together, and then you put the rest of the edifice together after the foundation, of course.
Yeah. On this topic, it's something that's been dear to my heart since I started working at a mega church since I was 20. And I fell in love with the idea of making disciples. And so I asked the question, fundamentally, what is a disciple and how do we make one?
Yes.
So that's part of the reason I stumbled onto the Torah thing and it scared the bejeebers out of me. I'm just telling you, oh my gosh, is this how God disciples people? What I figured out is that God designed people to not listen to endless lecture. Lecture is good. A lot of good information there. But the way that most people learn is not through reading and it's not through lecture. What people learn most from is through experience.
That's correct.
And so what Yahweh did was he created his feast days and even the food laws. These are all experiential things. And so it's true. A child, by doing these things, these experiences, learns, and it doesn't stop with adults. No. We learn experientially as well.
Sure we do. Yeah, that's right. And as you point out, lecturing is actually a higher form of learning that requires a foundation laid first. And then hearing lectures, I spent all day at some lectures yesterday, for instance, about a very fascinating topic. This was deep stuff, and it was very, and the only kind of thing you could probably transmit in a well-designed, organized lecture format.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of preparation. So when I went into this, I already had so much background that I could track with the speaker, right?
Yeah.
And if you can't track what the speaker's doing, then you're not accomplishing a whole lot. So, and that's the problem. The lecture format is a terrible way, in some ways, to introduce people to a topic.
Yeah, and
it has to be more interactive.
Right.
It's valuable, and it has its place.
That's right. Or we wouldn't be doing what we're doing right now.
And I frankly would not want to eliminate it, as some people advocate, because it's very important. In my discipline in physics, it's important for the students to get a certain degree of interaction with the subject material, so they begin to understand what the relevant issues are and things of that nature. And the human beings don't always naturally organize things well because they don't know what to anticipate. For them, this is exploration. It's like asking a mountain man to go out and say, well, why don't you find the best trail through the wilderness? And the mountain man's telling you, well, wait a minute, I got to first go through the wilderness before I can find the best path through it.
Yeah.
And so, so the lecturing and the didactic teaching is something that can follow on the heels of experiential knowledge, so that people can put things in the right, proper order and place.
Well, we need to couple them together.
That's exactly right.
And the person who's really going to learn and grow is the person that's doing it and learning from teachers and bringing those two things together. Yes. All right. So Gary, I'm looking at the clock here. We've got 20 minutes and I want to make sure that I give you ample time. You're going to connect some of these concepts to New Testament somehow.
Yes, I thought I would. And,
I want to hear about that.
Yeah, in a very overview sense, just to give people the understanding of just how much of the New Testament talks about these things. I think they will be amazed, actually. So what I first will do is kind of walk you through some the books of the New Testament and some of the key ones for which the festivals are not only discussed, they form the major framework around which the epistle or the book is organized and developed. And this in itself is staggering when you think about it. Now, if I start with the Synoptic Gospels, we of course know that in the Synoptic Gospels, there's not a lot of, if I count number of verses devoted to discussing these kinds of issues, it might be a rather small, subset. It might comprise maybe a few chapters or something, in the Synoptic Gospels, but they are important information. In other words, because it is very clear, even in the Synoptics, that the Passover is very much linked to the sacrifice of Messiah. That's one of the key things that is developed in the Synoptic Gospels. There are a few other things developed as well, but the sacrifice of Messiah being the redemptive act that sort of parallels the act that was done in Passover is something that I think few people would take any umbrage with at all.
So if you're a listener and you don't know what the Synoptics are, Matthew, Mark, Luke.
And Luke, yeah. So just think, no John.
Yeah.
John is special, and he is. And here's where things are very interesting. And I first got key to this back in the mid-'80s. I read a book called The Outpouring by a man named Elwood McQuaid. And it was very interesting because he's an evangelical scholar, a pretty good one. And he saw something in John that I hadn't seen anyone else ever talk about, which was the idea that the festivals in the book of John are everywhere. They saturate Yeshua's teachings. And he was right about that. And in fact, when I started looking at it later, I realized there was even some that he missed. He did a good job, by the way. I thought it was an excellent book. But I found, because after I started particularly doing them, I recognized things that he didn't pick up on, although he may have come to understand it later, but it just wasn't in his book specifically. And so there's this sense you begin to see things and they just start leaping off the page. And what I've determined is that the festivals are mentioned in all but 3 chapters of the book of John, and they form the foundation and the basis for the teaching that Messiah is giving to his audience in those chapters. That's a lot of material. Yeah. There's a lot of material. And some of it is very much direct, very obvious, kind of in your face, if you will. Some of them are a little more subtle. Let me give you an example of a subtle one. And it's in John 4:35. And I'll read this verse, and I'm using this as an example, just the kinds of things that you become sensitive to in the reading of the text that you would not be sensitive to if you didn't have this understanding. Messiah has just been talking to the woman at the well. And then he says this: "Do you not say there are still 4 months, and then comes the harvest? I say to you, lift up your eyes and look to the fields, for they all are already white for harvest." Now, you would look at that and say, oh, that's cute. That's a nice little phrase. And we sort of get the spiritual application immediately. You're saying, oh, there's this great field out there, but I'm saying to you, there's one right in front of you.
Yeah.
You should be out doing the Father's business, and let's harvest people for Messiah. That's sort of would be the short gist of the spiritual meaning of this. But this passage has another relevance as well that people miss. It's telling you the time of year in which this took place. Why is that important? It's important because then we can connect it to a festival. And when we connect it to the festival and re-examine what Yeshua discussed with the woman at the well, all kinds of things start happening. You start to recognize that the very things that he's saying to her all pertain to the festival at hand. And so what is the time of year? 4 months to the harvest, but the fields are white with harvest. The feasts are in a 3-cycle harvest modality. That is, unleavened bread deals with the season of the barley harvest. Pentecost deals with the season of the wheat harvest. The harvests occur right around those times, usually just preceding those festivals. The fall feast, starting with Yom Teruah and all of the feasts that follow it, are just following the general harvest, the harvest of almost everything else in Israel. That's what we call the great harvest.
Okay.
So we have these 3 harvests that are being discussed here. So we're learning that, you say it's 4 months to the harvest, but the fields are already white with harvest. What is that talking about? Well, if you understand the agriculture, he's telling you the white harvest is the wheat harvest. Because what does wheat do when it's ready to harvest? It turns white. The whole thing turns white.
Right.
That's how you recognize that it's ready to, get out the machinery and get it off the field, And the barley harvest doesn't do any of that. The barley harvest is very different. So it wouldn't be talking about the barley harvest there. And in 4 months, well, when is Pentecost? It's at the beginning of the 3rd month. When are the fall festival seasons? They start at the beginning of the 7th month. 7 minus 3 is 4.
Yeah, I see it.
4 months. Yeah. It's so clear, isn't it? Now, why is Yeshua saying this? Well, as we talked earlier, there is a spiritual application that's very direct. But knowing the calendar, you immediately think, I got to look at the festivals, because the festivals are intertwined with the calendar, and they're intertwined with the harvest seasons, as I previously discussed. So now when I understand that, what's the setting of this? Well, here's the interesting thing. Yeshua, Jesus, is coming back out of Jerusalem to go home back to Galilee. Where were the festivals observed? In Jerusalem. And it appears, as far as we have record, Jesus made a point to go down and observe those festivals in Jerusalem almost on every occasion. Mm-hmm. He was almost certainly in Jerusalem for the specific purpose of observing the Feast of Pentecost. The feast is concluded. Now he's on his way back. And he decides to make this little detour through Samaria so he can talk to the woman at the well. And as he's going through, you look in John chapter 4, and if you understand the Feast of Pentecost, almost everything he says can be tied directly to the Feast of Pentecost.
Okay, so explicitly, she is thinking about the great harvest in the fall.
Yeah, yes.
Where Yeshua is saying, I've come for the right now. Look, the fields are white unto harvest. I'm getting ready to pour out my spirit.
Yes.
So that people will genuinely obey.
Yes.
And a little mind blown here. I hadn't, I don't think I had. I'm good enough to see the subtlety where I would have read that, but I hadn't sat there and processed exactly what Yeshua was saying, because I'm going to couple that now, because she's had 5 husbands, and the one that she's with now is not her husband, and now he's pouring out his spirit in that context. Oh yeah, Gary, that's pretty neat.
Yeah. And it's things like that, and that's not the only one. In the book of John. There's several others. Yeah. And you begin to understand, the entire book of John, the entire Gospel of John is loaded with this stuff.
Yeah, you used to always, I remember you saying, hey, when you're reading John, always ask yourself, what time is it?
What time is it?
Yeah.
Yes, John, you always have to ask yourself with John, what day is it? What time is it? John is very centered in that style. It's kind of, you could say it's the overarching stylistic aspect of the book of John. Continuing on, because I know our time's getting shorter.
I got about 10 minutes ish.
Okay, good. That should do it. And I'm only choosing now specifically the books for which what I have seen is that the festivals form a significant framework of the book itself. Both 1st and 2nd Corinthians framed around the festivals. This is amazing. This is truly amazing. You think about the books of Corinthians and the Corinthian church, we look at them as largely a Gentile church, and that's correct. They started in a synagogue, and they started with Jewish believers and a few probably God-fearers who were Gentiles in this initial phase. But that phase didn't last very long, because apparently this was a very evangelistic church and very on fire church. And so basically they got kicked out of the synagogue. So they had to start their own fellowship group. And when they did, for some reason, Corinth is one of these very interesting paradoxes, I find. It was an extremely wealthy city. People cannot imagine how wealthy Corinth was. And if you've seen some of the new work that's been done, wonderful sort of 3D images where you can go in and you can kind of see, what did Corinth look like back in the day? You can actually find this stuff now, and more of it's coming out. It is like mind blowing. This was like the most exclusive resort city, even on today's standards, people would be impressed, and you realize the wealth. They had the games there, the Corinthian games were there, and this was important in the Roman Empire, and so they'd have people coming to meet in Corinth from all over the Roman Empire to attend these games, and they would set up tents. Remember, Paul was a tent maker. He had a good business there. He had a good business there because he was making tents, very likely for people coming to these games, and they would be just sprawled out in this whole meadow around the arena where and there would sometimes be hundreds of thousands of people there for these games, and so the city of Corinth being so wealthy, usually you don't find spirituality prospering when there's a lot of wealth.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, you
sure.
don't. I go today, and I have told people I've visited some very wealthy cities on the planet, and the Spirit of God is completely absent there.
Yeah. I would think
I see this time after time.
I think it'd be harder for a camel to go through an eye of a needle.
The needle, that's right. Than a wealthy man to accept the kingdom. Right? Yeah. So here we are. And yet Corinth was that anomaly. And I think for this reason, the Apostle Paul really loved that congregation. I think he had great affection for the Corinthian congregation. And so he's at a point in his life when he wrote 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it was on his 3rd missionary journey. There is abundant evidence for this, that during the entire 3rd missionary journey, Paul may have been on a Nazarite vow. Abundant evidence of this in the book of Acts.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at this. He's on a Nazarite vow. He's writing to the Corinthians, Gentiles. What is he writing about? He's plugging them into how the festivals form the backdrop for all of the things that he wants to teach them about the walk in Messiah. And how does a congregation form? How does it function? It functions in light of the understanding of these basic theological concepts, all of which are rooted in the festivals. And he essentially walks you through right in order throughout almost the entirety of the book of 1 Corinthians and into the first good chunk of 2 Corinthians. And so I look at that, and this is Paul. This is the Apostle Paul doing this. Okay. And that's, I think, impressive. Then moving on, Hebrews. Let's talk about Hebrews. Nobody wants to talk about the book of Hebrews.
I do.
Yeah, I know you do.
With you.
And me.
And chapter 7.
Yes. And then the list starts to dwindle a little bit, We know pastors that don't want to preach on the book of Hebrews. Can you imagine? Because it is a starkly contrasting book to what most people have been taught. And the book of Hebrews is all about Melchizedek. It's all about the narratives, right? The same narratives, by the way, of which these festivals highlight in their teaching and in their observance. It's all about the Day of Atonements. 2 chapters devoted strictly to the Day of Atonements and the importance of Messiah and how he fulfilled those days. Now we're about to chapter 12, and now we're just into the wrap up of the book of Hebrews, right? So the entire subject of Hebrews has the festivals as its backdrop. You must understand the festivals. You must understand those primary narratives to which the author is referring to really understand the full depth and richness of the message of Hebrews.
So on this, Gary, because we're podcast number 2 with you, we'll get to a lot of the nuances as we move along. But someone's listening to you and they're saying, well, yeah, Gary, you said exactly right. The book of Hebrews has those 2 chapters on the Day of Atonements and how Jesus fulfilled those things. So now that they're fulfilled, they're gone. We have the reality in the Messiah Jesus. Well, what do you mean then, fulfilled? Do you mean done? Do you mean, what do you mean?
Yes,
how do we understand this?
That's a good question. Let me do one other thing just in passing. I'll take a minute or two and I'll answer your question.
Okay.
It's a good place to stop. We go to the book of Revelation, another book that's a primary book. And when you're talking about prophecy and particularly understanding anything that might be regarded as new revelatory knowledge about the prophetic view, eschatology in general, the book of Revelation obviously stands out. You cannot understand the book of Revelation without understanding two primary things. You have to know a lot about the temple, and you have to know a lot about the fall feast. I mean, a lot. It's all structured around those two things. The chapters, particularly 7 to 19, you would be completely lost. And I'm afraid most people apparently are lost in that section because they don't understand the festival framework that underlies all of these visions and prophecies that John is being given there. So when I added it up, by the way, what I discovered is making a count by chapters. I came up with over a third of the New Testament that directly deals with this material, the festivals, their understanding, how they relate to prophecy, how they relate to our daily lives. A third, 1/3. Now that's a lot of information to just simply ignore in the New Testament. You have to understand it, and it relates to so many things, as I mentioned earlier. You cannot even begin to really get a foothold in the word unless you have some background of understanding in these things.
Yeah, now, on the Revelation part, poor pastors. You know that I work at a seminary. I'm trying to train pastors. They're coming for their theology, and I'm glad for it. But at the same time, they try to teach Revelation, and they really have no real grounding in these feast days. They know they exist. They try it, and they. What's weird is as they try to unpack the appointed times or feast days, I use those synonymously, of God. It's so academic. It's so what is that word when something is I can't remember. There's a special word when something's really academic, but it's like you're really, if you don't practice it, you really don't know it like you think you know it. And so they try to apply it or try to figure it out with Revelation. And for me, their eschatology is always, it almost sounds conspiracy theorist or very future oriented. Like, it gets, you get overly focused on the locusts and the helicopters and the faces and like, oh my gosh, just take it down a notch and you could really be a better, more sober-minded teacher if you knew what was going on in the feast days, because it's not really it's not really as fanciful as people want to make it out to be.
That's right. These things have real deep meaning, none of which I don't think there's a person on the planet yet that understands it all. But the good news is some of us are beginning to see the horizon because we have the background.
Yeah.
And I think this is going to increase, you see, and it's going to be rooted in things. I guarantee you, whatever's in the book of Revelation, it'll be supported in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And you start drawing these connections, and then you can be sure you have a double witness.
Okay, you got my last 4 minutes here, and don't forget to answer my question.
I'm going to do that right now with a verse that's familiar with to a lot of people, just to show you something here, because you talked about fulfillment.
Yeah.
And it's Colossians 2:17. So I'll read, first of all, 16 to give it context, and then we'll go right into...
and just make sure your mouth is enough in that mic.
Yeah. I kind of have to read it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Yeah, so I'll do this. Am I good?
You're good.
Okay. So 16, so let no one judge you in food or in drink or in regard to a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Okay, so that's one verse that I know is probably familiar to a lot of people, that is often discussed.
Well, yours didn't put in the word only.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I know what you're talking about. That's just inserted. It's not in the Greek.
It burns me up a little bit.
Yeah. That's what we call a little translator bias, unfortunately. And it does appear, and it seems to appear quite frequently in relationship to these kinds of questions, by the way. And so the reader beware.
Yeah.
You need to check those things out. What's fascinating about this verse, and I can't give you a full exegesis on it, I just want to illustrate something basically, but I would love to come back sometime and really flesh this out, because it's kind of mind-blowing. Not only is this verse not a good verse to use for people who want to assail the observance of these days, but it's actually doing the opposite. It's actually establishing it. But When you insert only, of course, then you can make it sound very different, can't you? One single word of insertion can make it sound very different. So the fulfillment here that's often referred to, people think of it, well, okay, there are these types. The Messiah fulfills the intent and purpose of these types. So now the types go away and they're no longer of value to us because we know they've been fulfilled, and it's something along those lines. I might be not doing it justice, but I think people catch the drift, what we're trying to say here. And in here, what's fascinating is if you look at the text carefully, and I'll draw your attention to, and it's translated okay here, and I'm using the New King James, which says they are shadow of things to come. To come. Now, that's not a bad translation, but an even better one, because the word in Greek there is in the participle form. It would be, they are a shadow of things coming. All right. Shadow of things coming. Oh, when did Paul write this? He wrote this around 60 AD. When did Yeshua die? He died around 30 AD. Okay. So probably 3 decades following. Whatever Yeshua did in regard to the feast while he was on the earth, 30 AD is the terminus for that, right? I think we can, approximately, right? I think we can agree to that. That's just logic.
Yeah.
But now, after this fact, Paul is saying, no, there are still things they foreshadow that are still to come. They are coming. We look for these things with anticipation. So indeed, these things are not fulfilled in the sense that people claim. Of course, the word fulfilled that is often used, I don't recall if it's in this passage, but in other places where similar issues rise up, is a Greek word that actually does not mean to fulfill, to terminate, but actually means to fulfill, to complete.
Yeah.
To bring to fullness, So even often that word that people will use in saying the things that you mentioned, they don't understand fully what the Greek is actually telling us here. And a good example of that is in Matthew 5:17. That section, 5:17 to 20, uses that same word. And when you really understand the context of Yeshua's teaching, we know he means it in the sense of completeness, making it full, rich, and complete, not to terminate because something has been done for you. So that's all I can say, I think, with the time.
Yeah, I think that word's pleroo, if I remember.
Yes, that's what it is, pleroo. Yeah.
Gary, thank you again. Gary is a very, very good at showing how those appointed times, the law of our God is replete throughout the New Testament. People say to me a lot, hey, I want to be a New Testament Christian. I do too. I certainly do. But, to think that we can understand the New Testament without first rooting it in the solid foundation of the Torah, living out the Torah life, it's just an exercise in guessing on what the Christian life should be like. Yeah. And we ought not do that. So let me tell you something, just to wrap up here, that our Messiah, Yeshua, he was the embodied Word of God. He embodied that Torah. And if you look at his life, it looks pretty gracious to me.
Yes, it does.
And it looks like one that glorifies the Father. And that's why we want to also, by the Spirit, walk in that Torah every day. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. See you next time.
Amen.